This is an intermediate hamburger pattern. It is pattern number 4160. Okay. So you're going to start off with a backwards forwards. Oh, and this is a paired up one, so you pair up your strings. And you're going to start off with your first row being entirely composed of backwards forwards. You begin a backwards knot, and then you end in a forward knot. You do that all the way across, so you have blue knots all the way across, or whatever color you're using for your background. So backward, forward, backward, forward, backward, forward, backward, forward, backward, forward, backward, forward. Okay, now you're going to leave off the ones on the outside. Oh wait, one more backward, forward. Totally forgot. And then you're going to be leaving out the ones on the outside, a blue on each side or whatever backward color you're using. And they're going to be doing a forward, backward all the way across. You have blue knots again all the way across. Backward. No, forward. Backward. Forward. Backward. Forward. Backward. Forward, backward, forward, backward, forward, backward. Okie dokie. That is done with the first two rows. Now you're on to your third row, and you're going to be bringing back in the sides. You're going to be doing a backwards forwards all the way across. So you get blue knots or whatever color you're using for your backwards, for your background again on the top. Backwards, forwards. Wait, no. Yes, backwards, forwards. Backwards, forwards. Backwards, forwards, backwards, forwards, backwards, forwards, backwards, forwards, and backwards, forwards. Now we're getting into actually making the burger. And we are on the fourth row, and we're going to be doing... I'm going to skip the fourth row, actually. I'm going to go straight to the the fifth row. And that is a backwards, forwards. Well, the fourth row is composed of forwards, backwards, all the way across, and that's just another layer of blue. You know what? No, let's do the fifth row. It's just another space in between the burgers, but it will make the rest of the bracelet maybe look a bit off-kiltered if I did not do it. So we are going to leave out the ones on the sides, and we are going to be doing forwards, backwards, all the way across. Forwards, backwards, forwards, backwards, forwards, backwards, forwards, backwards, forwards, backwards, and forwards, backwards. Perfecto. Now we are on to the 5th row, which is where we actually start making the burger, which is a backwards forwards. So you will have a blue knot. Then you will have a forwards backwards, which will be brown. Then you will have a forwards backwards, red over blue, red knot. Then you'll have another forwards backwards, green over blue. Then you have another forwards backwards. Then you will have a backwards forwards. And a backwards forwards. Okay, so at this point, I'm just gonna untape this, and since it's such a thick bracelet pattern, I'm gonna keep the tape as close as possible to where the bracelet ends so that it will just be easier in the long run. Okay, now we are on to our 6th row. Leave out ones on the side, and you're going to want to take your brown and make a backwards forwards so that the brown shows up onto the blue. Backwards forwards. Then another backwards forwards. Then another backwards forwards, green over blue. And then backwards forwards, brown showing up. And then another backwards forwards, so that brown shows up again. And then you are going to make a forwards backwards so that blue shows up at the very end. Okay, we are done with our 6th row, and we are on to our 7th row. We're going to start off with a backwards forwards so that blue shows up. At that point, then we are going to do a forwards backwards so that brown shows up. Then we are going to do forwards backwards so that red shows up. Then we're going to do a forwards backwards so that green shows up. And then we are going to do a forwards backwards so that brown shows up. And then another forwards backwards so that another brown shows up. And then we're going to be doing a backwards forwards so that blue shows up. Done with our 7th row, on to our 8th, and we are officially halfway through. You're going to be wanting to leave one out on the end. And you're going to want to do a backwards forwards so that brown shows up. A backwards forwards so that red shows up. Backwards forwards so that green shows up. Backwards forwards so that brown shows up. Backwards forwards so that brown shows up. Yes, backwards forwards so that brown shows up. And then a forwards backwards that blue shows up. There we go. Finished with our 8th row. On to our 9th row, and we are going to bring back in the sides. We are going to do a backwards forwards the blue shows up. A forwards backwards that brown shows up. A forward backwards that red shows up. Forward backwards that green shows up. Forward backwards that brown shows up. And forward backwards that brown shows up. Finish this row off with a backwards forwards so that blue shows up. There we go. That is the end of 9, and we are on to 10. Leave one out on each side. And we're going to start off with a backwards forwards that brown shows up. Backwards forwards that red shows up. Backwards forwards that green shows up. Backwards forwards that brown shows up. And a backwards forwards that brown shows up. Finish off row 10 with a forwards backwards that blue shows up. And perfecto. On to 11. Bring back in the sides and do a backwards forwards that blue shows up. Then a forwards backwards that brown shows up. Then a forward backwards that red shows up. Then a forward backwards that green shows up. Then a forward backwards that brown shows up. Then another forward backwards that brown shows up. And then a backwards forward so that blue shows up. Oh my goodness, this tape is just wiggling so unhelpfully. Okay, on to row 12. We're going to leave out one on each side. And we are going to do a backwards forwards so that brown shows up. A backwards forward so that red shows up. A backwards forward so that green shows up. A backwards forwards so that brown shows up. Whoa. Wrong brown. We want to use this brown. And a backwards forward so that brown shows up. And then a forwards backwards so that blue shows up. Perfect. On to row 13. Only 3 more rows left to go. Bring back in the ones from the sides and do a backwards forward so that blue shows up. You'll be using 2 blues. Perfecto. And then a 13, and then a backwards forwards, a forwards backwards so that brown shows up. And then a forwards backwards so that red shows up. Then a forwards backwards so that green shows up. And a forwards backwards so that brown shows up. Then a forwards backwards so that brown shows up. And a backwards forwards so that blue shows up. Okay, perfecto. On to row 14. Leave out the ones on the end and start off with a... Oh my goodness. And then start off with a backwards forwards so that brown shows up. Backwards forwards so that red shows up. Backwards forwards so that green shows up. Backwards forwards so that brown shows up. Backwards forwards so that brown shows up. Whoa. And then a forwards backwards so that blue shows up. Okay, done with row 14, on to row 15. Just one more to go after this one. Bring back in the ones from the sides that we set off with previously, and we are going to do a backwards. Oh my goodness gracious. Not a backwards, not a backwards. Jesus criminy. A backwards forwards so the blue shows up. Then a forwards backwards so the brown shows up. Then a forwards backwards so that, oh my gosh, I'm stepping on my strings. See, I'm intending to make this into a bookmark, so I need it to be long, but when you get up to having like 16 strings, it's difficult. Forward backwards so that red shows up. Forward backwards so that green shows up. forward, backwards, that brown shows up. And a backward, forward, so that blue shows up over the brown. And another backward, forward, so that blue shows up. Okay, on to our last row, row number 16. Leave out the ones on the edge and do forward, backwards, all the way, keep shaking that, forwards, backwards, all the way across, basically. Forward, backward, forward, backward, forward, backward, forward, backward, forward, backward, forward, backward. And that is how you do the hamburger pattern. Thank you for watching.